"Ignore him. He's old and tired," my son said, the words striking me harder than any blow. Yet before their sting could fully sink in, the governor stepped forward, grasped my hand with strength and honor, and in that single moment, the entire hall seemed to shift in silence and awe. From that instant, everything changed, and the lesson that would follow was one my son never expected to learn. Don't forget to subscribe and comment where you are watching from. I stood in the grand hall that evening surrounded by people who dressed in their finest, their conversations buzzing like restless bees, every voice eager to be heard and every smile sharpened with ambition. And though the chandeliers glittered and the tables overflowed with abundance, I felt strangely invisible, as though age had wrapped me in a cloak no one wished to look at. My son stood only a few steps away, his back tall, his suit immaculate, his laughter loud enough to draw the eyes of those around him, and he leaned into his companions with that air of confidence that comes so easily to youth when they believe the world belongs only to them. In that moment, he glanced back at me, his eyes narrowing with impatience, as though my presence weighed him down rather than lifted him. And with a smirk that still burns in my memory, he uttered those words that seemed to echo against the walls. "Ignore him. He's old and tired." The guests chuckled softly, some out of awkwardness and some out of cruel amusement, but none came to my defense, and I felt the heat rise in my chest as I stood silently, refusing to bow my head, though my heart trembled. What he and they could not see was the path that had brought me there, the years of labor when my back bent under the weight of endless work, the nights I spent awake calculating how to stretch every coin so his education would never suffer, the quiet meals I missed so that his plate could be full, the shoes I wore thin so his would always be strong enough to carry him forward. None of them saw the sacrifices that carved the lines on my face, the sacrifices that built the very foundation on which he now stood so proudly. And perhaps that is why his words seared me so sharply, because they carried the sting of ingratitude wrapped in arrogance. Yet as those words still lingered in the air, the doors opened and the governor entered. A man whose presence commanded silence as naturally as the sun commands light, and the room shifted, conversations cut short, backs straightened, eyes widened in anticipation. My son adjusted his jacket quickly, stepping forward as though this was his moment to shine, eager to place himself in the path of greatness, but fate did not smile on him as he expected. For when the governor's eyes swept across the crowd, they did not stop on the tall young man with the eager smile, but rather on me, the figure in the corner whom everyone else had overlooked. He paused, his gaze steady, and with purpose in his stride, he walked past my son and extended his hand toward mine. I can still feel the strength of his grip, firm and deliberate, a handshake that spoke volumes of respect, and in that instant the laughter died, the whispers halted, and the hall fell silent, as all eyes turned to witness what they had not expected. The governor called me by name, and in that sound there was honor, there was recognition, there was dignity returned to me in front of all who had dismissed me moments earlier. My son froze, his face drained of color, his mouth slightly open as though words had abandoned him, and I stood there holding the governor's hand, my heart swelling not with pride for myself, but with the vindication that truth always finds its way to the surface. In that single moment, the balance shifted, and the arrogance that had cut me down was met with the justice of respect. For the story of who I was could not be erased by a careless insult. That was the beginning of a lesson my son was destined to learn, a lesson written not in lectures but in the living proof that respect cannot be denied to one who has earned it through sacrifice and perseverance. The sting of disrespect does not fade quickly, and though the governor's handshake had restored my dignity in front of every man and woman gathered that evening, the echo of my son's words still weighed heavily in my chest, repeating over and over, as if etched into the very air around me. Ignore him. He's old and tired. And with every repetition I felt not only the insult of the moment, but the ache of years of sacrifice dismissed in a careless phrase. For there is no deeper cut than the one delivered by your own child when he no longer sees you as a pillar, but as a burden. I stood quietly as the room regained its chatter. Though the tone had shifted, whispers now circling about the governor's recognition of me. Glances directed my way, carrying something closer to respect than they had moments earlier. Yet my heart did not celebrate, because the one gaze that mattered most to me was turned away in cold silence. I thought of how easy it would have been for him to say nothing, to simply stand tall without pushing me down. Yet he chose cruelty, and in that choice, he revealed how far he had wandered from the values I had once instilled in him. Memories flooded me as I stood there. Memories of long days under the sun when sweat poured from my brow and my hands blistered. Memories of nights when I lay awake counting bills to see if I could afford his school books. Memories of the small boy who once called me his hero, when I fixed his bicycle with nothing but patience and stubbornness. And I could not help but wonder how that boy had grown into a man so quick to mock the very hand that had carried him through storms. Disrespect stings most when it is public, when strangers witness your own blood casting you aside, and I felt the burn of humiliation like fire under my skin, my eyes heavy though I refused to let them fall, my back aching, though I kept it straight. For dignity is the last refuge of a man stripped of recognition, and I would not let mine crumble before the sneers of others. I could almost hear my late father's voice, reminding me that pride must be held even when the world seeks to take it. And so I stood unmoving, though inside I felt the pain ripple through me like waves against a fragile shore. My son, oblivious to the weight of his insult, continued to carry himself with the arrogance of one who believed the future belonged to him alone, his smile flashing at peers, his laughter ringing out as though he had conquered something by belittling me. And it was in that moment that I realized the gulf between us was not measured in years but in values. The sting of disrespect grew heavier as I recalled how often I had shielded him from hardship, how many times I had gone without so that he could have more, how often I had stood silent when others mocked me, thinking that his rise would make my silence worthwhile. And yet, here he was, dismissing me with a smirk before men and women who did not know the cost of his ascent. I clenched my hand around the cane at my side, not because I needed support, but because it grounded me, kept me steady while the storm inside me raged, and in that grip I found resolve not to let this insult define me. The sting of disrespect is sharp, but it can also be fuel. And as the governor's words of respect still echoed faintly in the background, I made a quiet vow that I would not let my son's arrogance go unchallenged forever. For there comes a time when even a father must remind his child that roots cannot be cut without consequence. The night carried on, laughter resuming, glasses clinking. Yet for me the world had narrowed into two truths: that my son had revealed his heart for all to see, and that I, though wounded, was not defeated. I walked from that hall with a heavy chest, but also with a spark burning inside me, a spark born not of anger alone but of clarity. For I understood now that respect must sometimes be taken back, not demanded, but earned through truth revealed. And the sting of his words would one day serve as the spark that lit the fire of his reckoning. Memories of sacrifice have a way of rising unbidden, And after the sting of my son's words that evening, I found myself carried back through the corridors of my life, each memory reminding me of the countless steps I had taken, not for myself, but for him, because everything I had ever done was driven by the hope that my son would one day stand taller than I ever could. And yet, in chasing that dream, I had given pieces of myself until little was left but the lines on my face and the ache in my bones. I remembered the first years, when money was so scarce that I often went to bed hungry, slipping the last portion of food onto his plate and smiling as if I had already eaten, convincing him that my hunger was nothing but a choice, when in truth it gnawed at me deep into the night. And still I endured, because his full stomach meant he could grow strong. I remembered working double shifts in factories where the air was thick with dust and sweat, my hands raw from machines that never slept. And though exhaustion threatened to crush me every evening, I pressed forward, because his school fees had to be paid on time, because his shoes had to fit without holes, because his books had to be new enough to carry him proudly into class without shame. I remembered the winters when the cold crept through the walls, when I wrapped him in the warmest blanket and kept only a thin one for myself, lying awake shivering so he could sleep soundly. Dreaming of a future he would never know came at the cost of my own comfort. I remembered the day he looked at me with tears in his young eyes, because he had been mocked by other children for not having the latest toy, and I sold the watch my father had left me, the last keepsake of his memory, just so I could place that toy in my son's hands and watch his face light up with joy, telling myself that no price was too high if it meant his smile would return. I remembered repairing his school projects late at night, guiding his hand as he learned to write, clapping the loudest when he received small awards, and carrying him on my shoulders when his legs grew tired, never once letting him feel the weight of the world, because I carried it for him. I remembered how many times I turned down opportunities for myself, promotions that would have taken me away from home for too long, because I wanted to be present at his games, his recitals, his milestones. And though the money would have eased our lives, I chose his presence over wealth, believing that love and guidance mattered more than comfort. I remembered the sacrifices that no one saw, the nights I prayed silently over him when he slept, asking God to grant him wisdom, to spare him from the mistakes I had made, to let him grow into a man of honor and respect. For all I ever wanted was to leave him better than I had been. Yet, standing in that hall, hearing his cruel dismissal, I could not help but wonder if perhaps my sacrifices had bred arrogance instead of gratitude, if by giving too much I had taken away his chance to learn humility. The memories came not as regrets, but as reminders of the truth, for though he may have forgotten, I had not, and the sacrifices etched into my body and my soul were proof of the love I carried for him, proof that could not be erased by a single insult. Each scar, each wrinkle, each callus told the story of nights endured and days conquered, and though he may see me as old and tired, I knew that behind those words lay the strength of a father who had endured every hardship for his child. The memories burned within me, not as sorrow but as fuel, for I knew that one day the truth of those sacrifices would surface, and when it did, he would finally see that the man he dismissed was the very foundation of the life he stood upon. The rise of arrogance in my son did not happen in a single day. It was a slow and creeping change that unfolded before my eyes like a shadow stretching longer as the sun sinks lower. And though I noticed it in small ways at first, I told myself each time that it was only a phase, that he would return to the humble boy who once clung to my hand and looked at me with pride. Yet, With each passing year, I saw more clearly how pride twisted into vanity and confidence, hardened into contempt, until the boy I had raised was no longer recognizable in the man who now stood before me. I remember the early signs when he was still in school and began to look at classmates not with kindness but with comparison, measuring his worth by what others had and what he could show off. And when I tried to remind him that true respect is not built on possessions but on character, he nodded absent-mindedly, but his eyes were already drifting toward the wealthier families whose children flaunted clothes and gadgets we could not afford at the time. Later, when I worked longer hours and we began to climb out of poverty, I noticed how quickly he embraced the finer things, his gratitude for simple meals fading as he demanded more, his joy in shared moments shrinking as he sought validation from peers who admired the material rather than the moral. I told myself that adolescence often brings such distractions, that maturity would ground him, yet as he grew older, I realized maturity had taken a different shape in him, one molded not by discipline and gratitude, but by the intoxication of status. When he entered university, funded entirely by the sweat of my labor, his letters home spoke less of learning and more of networking, of circles he was eager to join, of professors he flattered, and friends with influential parents he admired. And I felt pride, clouded by unease, because while he excelled academically, his humility was slipping further away with each achievement. He began to visit less often, and when he did, I noticed how his tone toward me grew sharper, as though the simplicity of my life embarrassed him, as though my worn hands and plain clothes were reminders he preferred to ignore. And though I swallowed the hurt, I could not deny the growing gap between us. When he started working, his arrogance bloomed fully, for he believed himself a self-made man, blind to the years of sacrifice that had paved the road he walked upon, and he wore his success like a crown, while treating me as though I were a servant unworthy of his throne. I saw it in how he corrected me in public when no correction was needed, how he rolled his eyes when I offered advice, how he introduced me to others without pride, his voice flat and dismissive, as if admitting I was his father would somehow tarnish the image he wished to present. It was as though every inch he climbed on the ladder of social status pushed me further down in his eyes, until I became not the foundation but the burden he wished to cast aside. Yet the cruelest part of his arrogance was not directed only at me but at those around him, for he treated waiters as though they were invisible, colleagues as though they were rivals, and friends as though they were stepping stones. And I knew then that he had chosen a path that led not to honor, but to eventual downfall. Still, as a father, I hoped, I prayed, I tried to speak gently, to remind him of where he came from, of the values I once taught him. But he brushed off my words with the impatience of one who believes wisdom is outdated simply because it comes from older lips. The rise of his arrogance was like watching a house I had built with my own hands catch fire slowly, smoke curling into the air while I stood powerless, knowing that everything I had invested might one day turn to ash. Yet still I hoped that something, someone, or perhaps fate itself would awaken him before it was too late. Little did I know that the awakening would come not through quiet reflection or gentle correction, but through the harsh light of public recognition, when all his pretenses would be stripped away, and he would be forced to confront the truth of who I was and who he had become. And though the arrogance had risen high like a tower, I knew towers built on vanity eventually crumble when the foundation beneath them is revealed. The public event where everything unfolded still lingers in my memory with a sharpness that no years can dull, for it was there that my son's arrogance sought its stage, and it was there that fate delivered a lesson neither he nor I would ever forget. And though the hall was filled with dignitaries, polished shoes clicking on marble floors, and chandeliers glittering above like constellations suspended in gold, I remember most clearly the feeling of being treated as though I were a shadow, present but unwanted, tolerated only because my existence could not be erased. The event had been organized to honor leaders, benefactors, and contributors to the community. Yet my son positioned himself among the crowd not as a humble participant, but as though he were already crowned with recognition. His chest out, his suit immaculate, his laughter loud and calculated to catch the attention of the important men and women who moved in circles of influence. I stood near the edge of the gathering, close enough to watch, but far enough that I would not intrude on his charade, and though part of me longed for him to acknowledge me proudly, another part had already resigned itself to being ignored, for I had seen too many times how he carefully placed distance between us when others of status were around. As speeches began, his eyes darted constantly, searching for opportunities to make himself visible, nodding eagerly when someone spoke of progress or achievement as though the praise belonged to him. And every time a hand reached for a glass or a whisper carried down the table, he leaned forward ready to seize the moment, desperate for validation from strangers whose respect meant more to him than the love of his own father. I watched him laugh with peers, each chuckle exaggerated, each gesture rehearsed, and I felt the ache of knowing that the boy who once found joy in my stories at the dinner table now found greater joy in being seen by men and women who barely remembered his name. The event was grand in scale. Music playing softly in the background, servers gliding between tables with trays of wine and delicate dishes, conversations weaving like threads across the room. Yet for me it was a stage where my son performed tirelessly, never once glancing my way unless it was to remind others silently that I was no more than an afterthought. I saw how he introduced acquaintances to each other with practiced confidence, how he dropped names of people he barely knew in order to elevate himself, and I saw how he stiffened whenever anyone glanced in my direction, as if my presence risked exposing a truth he did not want revealed, the truth that his foundation was built on the sacrifices of a man he now treated as a burden. The public event was not about celebration for me. It was a mirror reflecting every sacrifice I had made, every opportunity I had given up, every coin I had stretched so that he could stand where he stood, and though I was proud of the life he had built, I could not ignore the bitterness that came with knowing he had built it by climbing over the back of the father who raised him. When the master of ceremonies announced the arrival of the governor, the room hushed, the crowd shifting with anticipation, and my son immediately adjusted his tie, his movements betraying the excitement he could not contain, for this was the moment he had been waiting for. The chance to align himself with the man whose presence commanded respect across the state. He inched forward subtly, ensuring he was in the path of introductions, his smile poised, his hand ready, and I stood back as always, prepared to watch silently while he reached again for glory. Yet beneath my calm exterior, I felt a storm brewing, for I knew deep inside that arrogance eventually meets its reckoning. And while my son performed for admiration, fate was preparing to strip away his mask in front of the very people he sought to impress. That public event, meant to be an evening of honor and prestige, became instead the stage for a lesson carved into memory, the night when respect shifted from the false confidence of youth to the quiet strength of sacrifice, and though I did not yet know how, I sensed even then that the story of that night would not belong to him, but to me the man he had dismissed as old and tired. The governor's arrival was like the turning of a great tide, and even before his figure appeared in the grand doorway, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations tapering off into murmurs, glasses set down carefully on tables, and eyes turning in unison toward the entrance, as though pulled by an unseen force. For the presence of a man of such stature carries weight long before his voice is heard. And in that silence I saw my son straighten his shoulders, smooth his tie, and edge his way closer to the aisle where the governor would soon walk. His eagerness written in the way his hands fidgeted, and his smile stretched tight across his face. I remained at the margin of the hall, my place not assigned but assumed, for I had grown used to being overlooked when the lights of power shone on others, and though my body carried the fatigue of years, my spirit remained observant, recording every detail as though it were etched upon stone, because I knew even then that this moment would matter. The chandeliers glittered with a golden glow that reflected off polished marble floors, casting shifting patterns as the doors opened slowly, and into that glow stepped the governor, tall, composed, every line of his suit sharp, every motion deliberate, his very presence commanding the kind of respect that cannot be demanded but simply exists, and the crowd reacted as though royalty had graced them. Backs straightening, whispers fading to silence, eyes widening with anticipation. My son moved closer still, aligning himself so that when the governor passed he would be among the first to be noticed, his body leaning forward slightly as though his ambition could reach out before his hand did, and I watched with a quiet sadness, for his movements betrayed desperation more than confidence. A hunger for recognition that consumed him so thoroughly he could not see how transparent it had become. The governor's entourage followed at a respectful distance, men and women with measured steps, yet it was the governor alone who drew the room's attention, his eyes scanning the hall, not with haste, but with the calm assurance of one who knows that every gaze already belongs to him. I saw my son's lips part, his hand twitch at his side as if preparing for the handshake he believed was inevitable, and I felt the ache in my chest as I realized he had come to define himself entirely by such moments where the acknowledgement of others mattered more than the truth of who he was. The governor's steps echoed softly, yet powerfully, the rhythm of his shoes striking marble in a cadence that matched the hush of the room, and in that silence I heard the faint rustle of gowns, the distant clink of glasses hastily set down, the collective breath of people waiting to bask in proximity to authority. I stood still, my cane resting lightly in my hand, not expecting nor desiring to be seen, and yet there was a strange calm that settled over me, as though some unseen current was shifting, preparing to carry me toward a moment I had not sought but could no longer avoid. My son glanced back briefly, his eyes landing on me with that same dismissive impatience he had worn earlier, and then he turned away as though to remind me and himself that I was irrelevant here, a relic too old and too tired to matter in a gathering of the powerful. And though his dismissal stung, I said nothing, for I had long learned that words spoken in defense of dignity are often wasted when the listener has already decided not to hear. The governor continued forward, his gaze sweeping the hall, and as he drew nearer I felt the tension in the air grow heavier, the crowd almost vibrating with anticipation. Each person eager to be the one his eyes would rest upon, each heart beating faster at the chance of acknowledgement, and my son, standing at the edge of that anticipation, was practically glowing with expectation. Yet in that moment, as the governor's eyes moved across the room, I sensed something shift. A subtle pause in his stride, a flicker of recognition in his gaze, and though I could not yet know its meaning, I knew enough to feel that destiny was about to step out from the shadows, and the story that had begun with humiliation was about to take a turn neither my son nor the crowd would ever forget. The public insult came like a blade disguised as a jest, and though my son had wounded me many times before with his cold indifference or dismissive tone, nothing compared to the sting of hearing his voice rise above the hush of the gathering in that hall, as he uttered words that were meant to push me into the shadows. Words that clung to the marble walls and echoed through the silence left in the wake of the governor's arrival. For as the governor paused mid-stride and the air thickened with anticipation, my son leaned slightly forward with a half-smirk curling his lips and declared for all to hear, "Ignore him, he's old and tired." And in that instant I felt the room tilt against me, the sting of laughter and whispers breaking like a wave against my back, stripping me of dignity in the eyes of those who had no right to judge. The insult was deliberate, crafted not only to dismiss me but to elevate himself, for in his mind pushing me down made him rise higher, and I could see in the gleam of his eyes that he believed those words would endear him to the powerful, that by treating me as a relic of no importance he could align himself more closely with the future. Yet he did not realize that such arrogance reveals itself more loudly than any insult, exposing the rot beneath the polish. I stood still, my hand tightening against the cane at my side, my breath caught between pride and shame, my heart torn open by the realization that the child I had once carried on my shoulders now sought to bury me beneath his ambition, and though my instinct was to look away, to shrink from the eyes that suddenly turned in my direction, I forced myself to hold steady, to keep my gaze firm, because, if nothing else, I would not let him see me broken. Around me the reactions rippled quickly, a few guests chuckling softly, as though to align themselves with the youthful cruelty of his words, others averting their eyes uncomfortably, and some simply watching with detached curiosity, content to witness the humiliation of a man too old to fight back. My son adjusted his jacket as he spoke, his voice carrying with a confidence that belied its cruelty, and I knew that to him I was not a father in that moment but a prop, a piece of scenery he could use to stage his own performance of charm and sophistication before the governor. And yet I also knew that arrogance built on such foundations cannot endure. The insult struck me deeper, because it came not from a stranger, but from the very son whose life had been carved from my labor, whose education had been purchased with my hunger, whose path had been cleared by the calluses of my hands, and as his words echoed in my ears, I felt the weight of decades pressing down, the memories of sleepless nights, the sacrifices made in silence, the pride swallowed when I endured humiliation elsewhere, so that he would never know the shame of want. I could feel the sting building like a fire in my chest, my lips tightening to keep from trembling, my jaw clenched to keep from betraying the hurt. And in that stillness I made a choice, not to respond, not to plead, but to endure. For I understood that the truth has a way of rising to the surface even in the midst of insult. My son, blinded by his own arrogance, turned his body slightly toward the governor, as if to draw him into his performance, certain that his insult would be shared, certain that the governor's gaze would pass over me without pause. Yet in his eagerness he failed to notice the subtle shift already happening in the room, the way silence had deepened, the way eyes no longer lingered on him with admiration, but with unease. And though he did not see it then, the seeds of his downfall were already being sown in the fertile soil of his arrogance. For me, the insult became more than humiliation. It became the turning point, the moment when the pain of disrespect transformed into the resolve of quiet endurance, and though I did not yet know what would come, I felt the faint stir of destiny preparing its hand. For sometimes, life waits for arrogance to bare its teeth before it delivers the bite of truth, and on that night, my son had bared his teeth fully, unaware that his prey was not me but himself. The unexpected recognition came in a moment so swift and profound that it seemed to silence not only the room but also the very sting of my son's insult, for as his words still lingered in the air, mocking me as old and tired, the governor halted mid-step, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly as though searching for something others had missed, and then, to the astonishment of every man and woman present, he turned his gaze directly toward me, bypassing the eager posture of my son, ignoring the polished smiles and outstretched hands around him, and walked steadily toward where I stood near the edge of the gathering, his stride measured, his expression purposeful, until he stood before me and extended his hand in a gesture so deliberate and respectful that the entire hall seemed to shift on its axis. I felt the warmth and firmness of his grip, strong yet steady, his eyes meeting mine not with condescension but with recognition, as though he saw in me something that the others had been too blind to notice. And in that moment, I felt the weight of humiliation lift, replaced by a dignity that had long been buried under years of sacrifice and silence. The crowd gasped softly, whispers spreading like a wave, and I could see faces turning toward one another in confusion, mouths slightly open, as though they could not comprehend why the governor had bypassed the young and ambitious to honor the man, dismissed as irrelevant. My son froze, his smirk vanishing, his body stiffening as though struck, his eyes wide with disbelief. And though he tried to mask his shock with a forced smile, his hands betrayed him as they twitched nervously at his sides. The governor spoke then, his voice calm yet carrying authority that filled the room, calling me by name and recalling moments from the past, moments I had long forgotten, contributions I had made quietly, without fanfare, sacrifices that had built the very foundation of progress for which others now celebrated. I stood stunned, not at the memory of my own deeds, but at the knowledge that someone of his stature had remembered, that someone had carried in his heart the respect I had never sought but always earned. Around us the atmosphere changed, admiration shifting like sunlight breaking through clouds, eyes that had once passed over me now fixed with newfound respect, lips that had whispered mockery now forming words of awe, and in that transformation I felt a vindication more powerful than any response I could have spoken in defense of myself. My son, caught in the wreckage of his own arrogance, tried to step forward as if to reclaim attention, but his movements only drew more glances of pity or disapproval, for the contrast between his dismissal and the governor's honor was too stark to be ignored. I looked at him briefly, his face pale beneath the chandeliers, his jaw clenched as though holding back frustration, and in that look I saw the truth. He was not only embarrassed, he was undone, for the very stage he had crafted to elevate himself had instead become the platform for my recognition. The governor continued to hold my hand, speaking of strength, of dedication, of the unseen pillars that hold up communities and families alike, and though I felt humbled, I also felt a surge of pride, not in myself alone, but in the justice of the moment, for it proved that respect cannot be erased by careless words, that dignity cannot be stolen by those who fail to see it, and that truth will always find its way to the surface. The room applauded softly at first, then louder, a ripple of admiration swelling into a tide, and I stood quietly, my heart steady, allowing the sound to wash over me, not as validation, but as confirmation of what I had always known deep within, that the worth of a man is measured not by the arrogance of others, but by the lives he touches, the sacrifices he makes, and the respect he earns without ever demanding it. The unexpected recognition was more than a handshake, more than a public gesture. It was the moment when years of sacrifice, silence, and humility rose up from the shadows and stood in the light, undeniable, unshakable. And it was the moment my son learned that the man he had dismissed as old and tired was the very man whose name carried weight, whose hand the governor himself sought out, whose dignity could not be diminished. Memories of contribution rushed over me in that moment when the governor's hand clasped mine, and though I stood quietly before the crowd, my mind traveled back through the many years when I gave of myself in silence. Not for applause or recognition, but because I believed that the strength of a man is measured by the marks he leaves on the lives of others. And those marks are often invisible to the eyes that seek only spectacle, yet they endure in the hearts of those who were lifted by them. I remembered the years when our community was fragile, when roads crumbled and families struggled, and I gathered neighbors together after long work days to patch broken paths with our own hands so that children could walk safely to school. The dust of gravel clinging to my skin, but my heart swelling with the knowledge that their journey would be easier than mine had ever been. I remembered how I built small programs for young men with nowhere to turn, teaching them trades late into the night after my own shifts had ended, showing them how to wield tools not as weapons but as instruments of dignity, watching their confidence grow as they earned their first wages and carried food home to their families, their gratitude shining in eyes that never forgot. I remembered speaking quietly to widows who had lost hope, helping them find work, carrying wood to their homes in winter, leaving bags of rice at their doors without names or notes, not because I wanted to be praised, but because I knew hunger too well to allow it to steal the light from another's table. I remembered how I invested every spare coin, not in luxuries for myself, but in opportunities for others. Quietly funding scholarships for children I barely knew, arranging apprenticeships, making introductions to men of trade who could change a young life with a single chance. And though I never spoke of these things to my son, I thought he would feel the weight of the values behind them, that he would inherit not my money but my heart. I remembered the long nights at town meetings, my voice hoarse from arguing for better wages for workers, my patience tested as I listened to officials dismiss us, and yet I never gave up, because I knew that if one voice did not rise, then no change would come. And when small victories were won, I stood at the back and let others celebrate, content to watch their smiles while I slipped away unnoticed. I remembered how I built businesses from nothing but sweat and stubbornness, not grand empires but small enterprises that employed neighbors, fed families, and gave dignity to men who had been cast aside by factories and offices that saw them as expendable. And though my name was never engraved on plaques or shouted from stages, the work endured, the lives sustained, the futures made brighter. And that was enough for me. I remembered the nights I came home to my son asleep, his face peaceful, his dreams fueled by the comfort I provided, and though he never knew the full cost of those comforts, I told myself he would one day understand, that one day he would see that his father had been more than old and tired. His father had been the unseen hand lifting him higher. Yet in that hall, as the governor spoke of those very deeds, recalling them with clarity I had forgotten, I realized that the world has a way of remembering what you think it has forgotten, that even silent contributions echo across time until they reach ears willing to hear. The crowd listened with a reverence I had never felt directed toward me. Their whispers filled not with mockery but with respect, and I stood quietly, my heart steady, knowing that though my son may never have acknowledged my sacrifices, others had, and their acknowledgment carried the weight of truth. These memories of contribution did not flood me with pride, but with peace. For they reminded me that every stone I had laid, every coin I had spared, every hour I had given had not been wasted. And though my son sought to erase me with a single cruel phrase, the foundation of my life could not be swept away. For it was built not on arrogance, but on sacrifice, and that is a legacy no insult can destroy. The governor's words that evening rang through the hall like a bell that could not be unheard, and though I had grown used to silence in the presence of men of power, his voice carried my name with such clarity and reverence that it seemed to breathe life back into the dignity my son had tried to strip away, for he spoke not in vague pleasantries, but with the weight of truth, recounting deeds I had performed quietly over the years, sacrifices made without expectation, contributions given without thought of reward, and as he spoke, I could feel the eyes of every guest shifting, their admiration rising not for the son who stood poised at the center of the room, but for the father he had dismissed as old and tired. The governor began by recalling the projects I had supported long before my hair turned gray, the community wells I helped fund with wages scraped from long days of labor, the youth programs I volunteered in when my body ached from work. And he told the gathering that true progress is never built solely on the shoulders of those in office, but on the silent strength of men and women who give without demanding, men like me who pour into others quietly, yet leave a mark too deep to be erased. My heart thudded with disbelief as he listed names of families I had helped, initiatives I had sparked, apprenticeships I had arranged for boys who had since grown into honorable men, and each word pulled back memories I had buried under years of routine, moments I had forgotten because I never thought them extraordinary. And yet, here was the governor, a man of authority, reminding the world that they were worth remembering. The guests leaned in, their whispers turning to gasps, their faces shifting from confusion to admiration, and in that wave of recognition I felt the tide turn. The ridicule of my son's insult drowned out by the thunder of truth carried on another man's voice. I glanced briefly at my son, his face stiff with shock, his smile faltering as though it could no longer hold against the weight of reality, his eyes darting nervously toward the crowd as he realized the attention he craved had been stripped from him, redirected to the man he had just dismissed. The governor continued, saying that leaders often forget the quiet giants among them, men whose backs bore burdens so others could walk upright, men who never sought to stand in the light but whose work illuminated the paths of countless others. And with each phrase he painted me not as a relic, but as a cornerstone, not as old and tired, but as steady and enduring. The applause that followed his words grew louder than the scattered laughter that had stung me earlier, and as the sound filled the hall, I felt a calm swell within me. Not the fleeting rush of pride, but the deep peace of vindication, for I knew then that no insult could erase the truth of a lifetime of sacrifice. My son shifted uncomfortably, his body betraying the storm that surely brewed inside him, and though I did not gloat, I could not help but let my eyes rest on him long enough for him to see that I was no longer diminished, that the narrative he had tried to weave had unraveled in the presence of undeniable truth. The governor's words did more than honor me. They restored the balance that arrogance had tried to distort, reminding everyone present that respect cannot be seized through boastful gestures or clever words, but is bestowed upon those who earn it through endurance, humility, and service. When he finally released my hand, he did so with a firmness that told me his gesture had not been for show but for sincerity. And in that grip I felt the acknowledgement of every sacrifice I had made, every silent act of giving, every night of exhaustion endured for the sake of others. And though my son may have never spoken such words to me, hearing them from the lips of the governor, before an audience of power and prestige, was enough to heal wounds that had bled quietly for years. The hall erupted once more in applause, and I stood with my head high, my shoulders steady, not because I craved their admiration, but because I understood that this was the moment destiny had chosen to reveal what arrogance had hidden. And in the governor's words I found not only recognition but the promise that the truth, no matter how long it takes, always rises to the surface. My son's shock was written across his face so clearly that no mask of charm could hide it, and though he tried to maintain the confident air he had worn all evening, the truth betrayed him in the trembling corners of his lips, the stiffness of his posture, and the sudden pallor that drained the color from his cheeks as the governor's words continued to pour respect upon me in front of all who had gathered. For the stage he had so carefully positioned himself upon had been pulled out from under him, leaving him stranded before an audience that no longer admired him, but pitied him. He had expected the governor's hand to seek his name to be called, his worth to be elevated by proximity to power, yet instead he found himself sidelined, watching helplessly as the spotlight turned to the very man he had mocked. As old and tired, and in that contrast, the arrogance that once looked like confidence now appeared hollow. The charm he had rehearsed now reeked of desperation. I watched him from where I stood, my hand still warm from the governor's grip. And though part of me felt the satisfaction of justice unfolding, another part felt a deep sadness. For no father wishes to see his child crumble before others. Yet neither could I deny that he had brought this upon himself with his cruelty and conceit. His eyes darted across the room, searching for allies, perhaps hoping to find faces still willing to nod in approval. But he found none, for the crowd had shifted, their admiration now directed toward me, their whispers carrying words of respect for the sacrifices I had made, and every murmur cut into him like a blade of truth. He forced a smile, a thin and trembling thing, trying to convince himself and others that he was unfazed. But the tension in his jaw, the twitch in his fingers, betrayed the storm raging within, and I knew that beneath the polished veneer his pride was shattering. I could almost hear the thoughts that must have thundered in his mind, questions of how this was possible, how the father he had dismissed could command such respect, how years of arrogance could be undone in a single moment of recognition. And though he tried to compose himself, the weight of those questions bent his shoulders lower than humility ever had. I remembered the boy he once was, eyes wide with admiration whenever I entered a room, his small hands gripping mine as though I were his whole world. And I could not reconcile that image with the man who now stood frozen, undone by the revelation that the father he sought to erase was in fact the man whose presence no one could ignore. His shock was not only at the governor's words, but at the collapse of the illusion he had built. For he had convinced himself that respect could be demanded, that admiration could be bought with charm and appearances. Yet here, before everyone, his theory was proven false, and in its place rose the undeniable truth that respect belongs only to those who earn it. I saw the flicker of panic in his eyes as the applause swelled, and I realized that his entire identity, built upon the fragile scaffolding of status and validation, was now teetering, and though I did not smile, inside I felt the weight of vindication. For this was not a humiliation I had engineered, but a truth delivered by destiny itself. The son who once mocked me as old and tired was now learning that the world does not bow to arrogance but to integrity. And though he would rage against it in private, in that hall he had no choice but to stand silent, his pride bleeding away in the face of a respect he could neither control nor claim. His shock was the beginning of his fall, the crack in the mask that would only widen with time, and as I stood firm under the glow of recognition, I knew that this was the moment he would never forget, the moment that would haunt him in every room he entered, for the memory of his father's unexpected honor would shadow every step he took, reminding him always that true respect cannot be dismissed, only earned. The crowd's reaction unfolded like a tide shifting directions, subtle at first yet impossible to ignore, and as the governor's words settled into the hearts of those gathered, I could see the ripple spread across the hall, whispers rising and falling like wind stirring through leaves, eyes darting toward me with newfound admiration, heads nodding slowly in respect, while my son, who had moments earlier basked in their approval, now found himself stranded in a silence colder than any insult, for he had sought their laughter at my expense, and instead drew their judgment upon himself. The applause began softly, a smattering of claps from the tables nearest us, uncertain at first as though testing the air, but quickly it grew, echoing off marble walls and crystal chandeliers, until the hall rang with a rhythm that belonged not to polite obligation, but to genuine acknowledgement, and in that sound I felt years of silence shatter, years of unseen sacrifice given form through the hands of strangers who now recognized what my son never had. I noticed the way faces turned to one another in surprise, mouths forming words like, "I never knew," and how remarkable, their gazes lingering on me not with pity but with reverence. And in those glances I saw the truth revealed. The man they had overlooked was not a shadow but a foundation, not old and tired but enduring and worthy. My son's face told its own story, his smile brittle, his eyes darting like a cornered animal seeking escape, his body stiff as though each clap struck him across the shoulders, and though he tried to stand tall, the weight of their shifted admiration bent him lower than humility ever had. A woman nearby whispered something to her companion, her eyes flicking from him to me with disapproval, and I knew she was reminding her neighbor of the cruel words he had spoken only moments before, words now magnified by the contrast of the governor's praise. And soon others did the same, their murmurs weaving through the applause, until the entire hall seemed to hum with the truth. The son's arrogance had been unmasked. Guests who had once laughed politely at his jokes now avoided his eyes, their smiles thinning, their bodies leaning subtly away as though his presence carried a stench of shame, and though none confronted him openly, the shift was unmistakable, for nothing isolates a man faster than the loss of admiration he believes he is entitled to. I stood in the center of that storm of whispers and claps, my heart steady, not swelling with vanity but with vindication, for I had never asked for recognition, yet when it came so thoroughly that it silenced mockery and cast light on truth. And I could feel the weight of every sacrifice, every labor, every sleepless night, settling into that applause as though the years themselves demanded justice. My son, sensing his grip on the crowd slipping, attempted to step forward, raising his chin, opening his mouth as though to speak. But his words were drowned by the governor's continued voice and the clapping that surged louder, and in that moment he realized what I had always known, that respect cannot be seized by force or demanded by pride. It must be given freely, and once lost, it cannot easily be regained. The crowd leaned closer to me now, some offering nods, some raising glasses in acknowledgement, their eyes carrying a warmth that contrasted sharply with the cold dismissal I had endured only minutes earlier. And in that warmth I found not triumph over my son, but peace within myself, the peace of knowing that truth had been revealed without my needing to lift a hand or speak a word. The governor's words still echoed, the applause still swelled, and the crowd's reaction became not only a judgment of me but also a judgment of him, a mirror reflecting his arrogance back upon him until he could no longer hide from it. And though he stood silently, I knew that inside he raged. For there is no torment greater to the proud than watching admiration shift away, watching respect settle on someone they believed unworthy. The crowd's reaction sealed the moment, transforming it from a passing recognition into a memory none of them would forget. And as I stood there beneath their gaze, I knew that my son's insult, once meant to erase me, had instead become the stage upon which my worth was revealed, and no amount of his posturing could undo what had already been set into the hearts of those who had witnessed it. The private clash came later that night. When the applause had faded, the governor had departed with his entourage, and the guests had left the hall buzzing with the memory of what they had witnessed, leaving only silence and shadows between me and my son. And it was in that silence that his mask cracked fully, for no crowd remained to admire him, and no hand reached out to validate his pride. And he turned on me with a fury that betrayed not only his humiliation, but his desperation, his voice rising in sharp tones that echoed against the empty walls, as he demanded to know why I had never told him of the things the governor had revealed, why I had let him stand there in ignorance, while others praised me for deeds I had never spoken of. He stepped close, his finger stabbing the air, his eyes wild, his lips trembling with rage as he accused me of robbing him of glory, of keeping secrets that might have elevated his status, as if my sacrifices were not gifts freely given, but treasures I had hidden from him. And though I felt the heat of his anger wash over me, I stood calmly, my cane steady in my hand, my eyes locked on his with a stillness that only years of endurance could grant. He demanded explanations, his voice cracking between fury and fear, asking how long I had known the governor, how many projects I had funded, how many programs I had supported. Each question flung at me like stones meant to break my composure, but I did not flinch, for the truth was simple. I had never sought recognition because the work itself was its own reward, and I had never spoken of it, because true giving does not demand an audience. The more I held my silence, the more his fury grew, his face flushed, his hands shaking, and I saw in that rage not only his wounded pride, but his inability to understand the language of humility, for he believed that everything of value must be leveraged for status, that respect exists only when displayed publicly, and so he could not comprehend why I had remained quiet about achievements that others now celebrated. He shouted that I had embarrassed him, that my silence had made him look small, that if he had known these things he could have used them to climb higher. And in those words, I saw clearly that his heart was not wounded by my choices, but by the collapse of his illusions. For the respect I had received that night had not elevated him, but diminished him, and he could not bear it. I let him rage, I let him pace, I let him throw his accusations into the empty hall, and when at last his voice cracked with exhaustion, I spoke only once, quietly but firmly, telling him that respect is not inherited like wealth, nor claimed like land, nor demanded like tribute. It is earned through sacrifice, through endurance, through service, and no amount of boasting or posturing could ever replace it. He froze at my words, his chest heaving, his eyes narrowing as though he wanted to argue, but he found no ground, for the truth stood unshaken between us. He tried once more to lash out, to insist that I should have told him everything, that I owed him the chance to wield my name like a weapon, but I simply shook my head, reminding him that what I had done in my life was not currency for him to spend, but lessons for him to learn. And if he chose arrogance over humility, then no amount of knowledge would have saved him from the fall he now endured. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by his ragged breath, and for the first time in years I felt not the weight of his disrespect but the strength of my own resolve, for I would no longer shield him from the truth of who he had become. He left me then, his steps angry, his shoulders rigid, but I knew the battle was not over. For humiliation festers in the proud until it demands either change or destruction, and as I watched him disappear into the shadows, I vowed silently that I would no longer allow his arrogance to trample my dignity, that the next time he sought to clash with me, I would meet him not with silence but with the full weight of truth. The father's resolve was born in that heavy silence after our clash, when the echo of my son's accusations still lingered in the air, bouncing off the marble walls of the hall long after he had stormed away. And though his rage had been sharp and his words cruel, I felt within myself a clarity I had not known for years, a firmness that settled deeper than anger. For what stirred in me that night was not the fleeting heat of revenge, but the cold, steady flame of resolve, the kind of flame that endures storms and waits patiently for its moment to burn bright. I had spent a lifetime bending under the weight of sacrifice, enduring insult, staying silent when my dignity was bruised, all in the name of love for my son. But his arrogance had grown like a weed, feeding on my silence, twisting my sacrifices into his sense of entitlement, and I realized that every time I endured without protest, I had allowed him to believe that my silence was weakness rather than strength. That night I resolved never again to let him mistake my patience for submission, never again to allow him to dismiss me as old and tired without consequence. For dignity once reclaimed cannot be surrendered again, and I knew that the time had come to stand not only for myself, but for the truth of what respect truly island. I thought of the governor's words, the applause of the crowd, the shift in admiration that had settled on me like a cloak of long-forgotten honor, and I realized that fate had handed me a weapon sharper than anger, for recognition once given cannot be taken back. And now the truth of my worth was no longer a secret carried quietly within me, but a reality witnessed by all. My son could rage, he could deny, he could lash out, but he could not erase what had been revealed, and in that knowledge I found strength. I resolved that I would no longer carry his burdens of arrogance, that I would let him face the weight of his own pride without shielding him, for only then might he learn the humility that life had so far denied him. I resolved that the next time he tried to dismiss me, I would not bow my head but meet his eyes, calm and unflinching, with the quiet certainty of a man who knows his own worth. I resolved that the sacrifices I had made would no longer be buried in silence, not because I sought glory, but because the truth must be spoken when arrogance seeks to distort it, and if my son wished to parade his successes before the world, then he would also have to face the reality of the foundation upon which they stood. I thought of the nights I had gone hungry, the days I had worked until my hands bled, the dreams I had set aside so that his could take flight, and I realized that by keeping those stories hidden, I had allowed him to believe that success appeared out of thin air, that privilege was natural, that his climb was his alone, when in truth it was built upon my shoulders, and I resolved that he would hear it from me, clearly, unmistakably, with the authority of a man who has nothing left to lose but his dignity. That night, as I sat in the quiet hall, the candles burning low, the echoes of laughter long gone, I felt the years of exhaustion fall away, replaced by a strength I thought I no longer possessed, a strength born not of youth but of conviction, and I understood that respect, once earned, cannot be erased by mockery, and once reclaimed, it becomes a fortress no insult can breach. My son believed that respect was his inheritance, a crown I would hand him without question. But my resolve was firm now. I would teach him, not with anger but with truth, that respect cannot be inherited, it must be earned, and if he refused to learn, then he would bear the weight of his arrogance alone. In that resolve I found peace, not the fragile peace of silence, but the unshakable peace of clarity, for I knew my path forward, and it was no longer one of quiet endurance but of deliberate truth, and with that truth I would stand, unbending, until my son either learned humility or was broken by the absence of it. The son's ultimatum came not long after the night of the clash, when pride still burned in his chest like a wound that refused to close. And though days had passed since the governor's recognition, I could see in his eyes that the humiliation haunted him, gnawing at him with every breath, and so he arrived at my home unannounced, his footsteps sharp against the floor, his jaw set with defiance, and without even a greeting he declared that things could not remain as they were, that if I truly cared for him, I would use the respect I had gained to elevate him, to repair the image he believed had been tarnished, and to restore the admiration he craved from the same crowd that had turned their attention to me. He stood tall, his shoulders squared, his tone commanding as though he were the father and I the child. And with a voice trembling between anger and desperation, he told me that I had embarrassed him by hiding my achievements, that I had made him look like a fool in front of those who mattered, and that now, if I wished to mend the wound between us, I would present him as my rightful heir, I would introduce him as the continuation of my legacy, and I would ensure that the power of my recognition flowed directly into his hands. I listened quietly, my fingers wrapped around the handle of my cane, my heart steady, though my chest ached with the weight of his words. For what I heard was not simply a demand, but a revelation of his heart, a heart so consumed with vanity that even in humiliation he could not see the lesson, only the opportunity to twist truth into advantage. He called my silence selfish, accused me of hoarding respect that should have been his, and as he spoke, his voice grew harsher, his eyes narrowing with frustration, as though he could bend me with his anger. But I did not bend, for my resolve had already been set the night of our clash, and his ultimatum only deepened it. He told me that if I refused, if I withheld what he believed he was owed, he would cut ties completely, that he would no longer acknowledge me as his father, that he would erase me from his life, as though I were nothing more than a ghost from a past he did not wish to claim. And though the threat should have pierced me deeply, I found instead that it rang hollow, for I had already been living as though erased, dismissed, and overlooked, long before he ever spoke those words aloud. His ultimatum was meant to force me into submission, to make me fear the loss of his presence. But what he did not understand was that a father's love is not a leash, and while I longed for the boy he once was, I could not yield to the man he had become, for yielding would not save him, but only tighten the chains of his arrogance. I told him nothing at first, letting his words hang in the air, watching the fire in his eyes flicker with impatience as he waited for my surrender. And then, with a calmness that surprised even me, I reminded him that respect cannot be transferred like money, cannot be bestowed like an inheritance, cannot be handed from one man to another as if it were property, for it must be earned in the quiet crucible of sacrifice and service. And if he had none of those to his name, then no title, no handshake, no introduction from me would ever sustain him. His face twisted at my refusal, his fists clenching at his sides, his breath sharp with fury. And he spat that I would regret this, that the world would see me as bitter and jealous, that he would rise without me. And for a moment I almost pitied him, for his words revealed not strength but fear. The fear of a man who knew deep down that without the foundation I had built, his tower of arrogance would crumble. He turned then, his footsteps heavy as he stormed from my home, the door slamming behind him with a finality that shook the walls, but I did not follow, I did not call after him, for I knew that the path he had chosen was his alone to walk. And though it pained me to watch him go, I also knew that sometimes the hardest lessons must be learned in solitude without the shield of a father's sacrifice to soften the blows. His ultimatum had been given, his threat made clear, and as I sat in the silence he left behind, I felt not despair but a deeper resolve, for I would not yield to arrogance, I would not surrender dignity for the sake of peace. And if he chose to cut ties, then let it be so. For I would rather stand alone in truth than walk beside pride in falsehood. The strategic silence that followed my son's ultimatum was not the silence of surrender, but the silence of calculation. For I knew that any words I gave him in that moment would be twisted. Any concession I made would only feed the hunger of his pride, and so I chose to hold my tongue, to let him walk away believing he had the upper hand, because silence, when wielded with patience, becomes a sharper weapon than anger ever could. In the days that followed, I did not call him, I did not chase him, I did not attempt to mend what he had threatened to break, and though the father in me longed to reach out, the man in me, the man who had been humiliated, dismissed, and pushed aside, understood that silence was the only answer arrogance could not consume. My son expected resistance, expected me to plead for reconciliation, expected me to rush in fear of his ultimatum. But when no plea came, no explanation offered, no hand extended, he found himself shouting into an emptiness that gave him nothing in return, and the very absence of my response became its own mirror, forcing him to face the hollow echo of his own threats. I remained steady, attending quietly to my days, walking the same paths, greeting neighbors who now looked at me with new respect after the governor's words. And I could feel the shift in the air wherever I went, for people began to approach me with gratitude, telling me stories of how something I had done had touched their lives, stories I had forgotten but they had carried for years, and though their voices humbled me, they also reminded me that truth does not need to be shouted, it only needs to be lived. My silence became a wall my son could not climb, and the more he pressed against it, the more desperate he became, for he realized that without my acknowledgement, without my participation, his efforts to reclaim status fell flat, and those who once admired him now looked at him with doubt, remembering his insult in contrast to the recognition I had received. I heard from others how he tried to spin the story, telling colleagues and acquaintances that the governor's words had been exaggerated, that my deeds were small, that the honor had been more courtesy than truth. Yet the more he spoke, the more people questioned him. For they had heard the applause themselves, they had seen the governor's firm handshake, they had witnessed the respect with their own eyes, and no amount of denial could erase what had already been written into memory. My silence gave space for his own arrogance to betray him, for each attempt he made to diminish me only made his bitterness clearer, and each denial only deepened the admiration others felt for me, because they saw in me a man who did not need to boast, a man whose dignity spoke louder than any words could. In my heart I wrestled with the pain of watching my son flounder, of knowing that he was spiraling not because of me but because of the weight of his own pride, and though a part of me wished to reach out, to offer guidance, I knew that breaking my silence would undo everything, that he had to face the consequences of his arrogance without the shield of my intervention. Silence became my strength, and each day I held it, I grew firmer in my resolve, for I realized that sometimes the greatest lesson is not delivered in arguments or confrontations, but in the quiet refusal to play the game pride demands. My son's arrogance thrived on attention, on reaction, on the energy of opposition, but when faced with silence, he had nothing to feed on, and so he began to unravel before others, his bitterness showing, his desperation leaking through cracks he could no longer hide. The strategic silence was not easy, for as a father I longed to speak, to guide, to heal. But as a man who had been disrespected and dismissed, I knew that silence was the only path that would teach him the truth that respect cannot be demanded, that it cannot be bought with anger, and that it cannot be manipulated from those who have earned it. And so I remained silent, watching as time itself became my ally, allowing the weight of truth to settle on his shoulders until he had no choice but to confront the reality he had tried so hard to escape, for silence, when chosen deliberately, is not weakness but power. And in that power I stood unbroken. The public exposure of my son's arrogance came sooner than even I expected, and it unfolded not in the shadows where he might have hidden his shame, but under the same glittering lights of another grand gathering, where men and women of influence once again filled a hall with laughter, ambition, and polite conversation, and my son, unwilling to accept the lesson of silence, returned to his performance, as though nothing had changed, stepping into the center of attention with a voice too loud, a smile too wide, and a confidence that reeked of desperation rather than charm. For he had convinced himself that if he spoke often enough, and boasted loudly enough, he could rewrite the memory of the governor's recognition. I stood at the back, as I often did, observing quietly, my cane resting lightly in my hand, and I saw him gesture grandly, dropping names of men he barely knew, recounting stories that stretched truth into falsehood, and weaving himself into narratives of success that did not belong to him. But this time the audience was not so easily swayed, for they remembered, and their eyes betrayed the shift of perception, their smiles polite but tight, their nods shallow, their patience thin. He boasted of connections he did not have, claiming influence in circles where he was barely tolerated, and when he mentioned the governor's name, attempting to align himself with the recognition I had received, the room grew colder, whispers rising like a low wind, for those who had been present that night knew the truth and were not fooled by his embellishments. One man, older and respected, leaned toward him and asked pointedly why, if he carried such influence, the governor had chosen to honor me instead, and my son faltered, his rehearsed lines collapsing under the weight of a question he could not answer, his smile twitching, his voice breaking for the briefest moment before he tried to laugh it off, but the damage had already been done. A woman nearby, her tone sharper than courtesy allowed, remarked that respect cannot be inherited, that it must be earned, and though her words were not addressed to him directly, the implication was clear, and heads around her nodded in agreement, their eyes flicking between him and me with a clarity that stripped away his pretense. I remained silent, offering neither defense nor accusation, for I knew that my silence now spoke louder than his words, and every time he boasted, every time he exaggerated, every time he tried to build himself higher by invoking my name, the truth of his arrogance became clearer, and the crowd began to see him not as confident but as desperate, not as accomplished but as hollow. The whispers grew bolder, laughter turning from polite to mocking, not loud enough to be cruel, but sharp enough to sting, and I could see the flush rising in his cheeks, the tremor in his hands as he gripped his glass too tightly, the dart of his eyes toward me as if hoping I might rescue him with an acknowledgement, but I gave him none, for this was the lesson he had to learn, and the stage he had built for himself was now the very place of his exposure. He tried once more to regain control, raising his voice, telling a story of how he had supposedly guided a community initiative, but before he could finish, another man interjected, recalling in detail that it had been my work, my hands, my persistence that had made it possible, and the room murmured in agreement, leaving my son stranded in silence, his story unraveling in plain sight. He stammered, his words faltering, and though he tried to laugh it off, the crowd no longer indulged him, their attention shifting away as though they had grown weary of his performance. And in that subtle turning of backs, I saw the final stroke of his exposure, for nothing cuts deeper into pride than indifference. I stood still, saying nothing, my dignity intact, my resolve unshaken, and though my heart ached to see him crumble, I knew that this was the truth he needed, the truth that arrogance, once exposed, cannot be patched with charm, that lies, once revealed, cannot be sewn back into credibility, and that respect, once lost, is nearly impossible to reclaim. The public exposure was not my doing. It was his own, the inevitable collapse of pride built on foundations of deceit, and as he stood there, pale and shaken, the son who had once mocked me as old and tired was forced to face the reality that the world had seen through him, and there was no hiding from it now. The fall of arrogance is never sudden. It crumbles piece by piece like a tower built on sand. And I watched it happen to my son in the weeks that followed his public exposure. For the man who once walked into every room with his chest high and his voice booming now entered cautiously, his smile brittle, his laughter forced, and though he tried desperately to reclaim the admiration he had lost, each attempt only deepened his descent, for the crowd that once tolerated his vanity now saw it for what it was, and no amount of boasting could disguise the hollow echo of his words. I heard whispers wherever I went, whispers not of me but of him, of how quickly respect can vanish, of how arrogance always demands a reckoning, and though no one confronted him directly, the subtle shifts were enough to break him. Invitations to gatherings grew fewer. Friends who once clung to his side now found excuses to drift away, and colleagues who once entertained his claims now responded with polite nods and quick departures, leaving him stranded in the silence he had once tried to cast upon me. I saw the change in his eyes, the way they darted nervously when conversations turned to matters of respect, the way his smile faltered whenever someone mentioned the governor's name, and though he still tried to carry himself with pride, the weight of humiliation pressed too heavily on his shoulders, bending him lower than humility ever could. He attempted to rebuild his image by clinging to me, arriving at my home with forced warmth, trying to speak of family, asking questions about the very contributions he had once mocked. But I met him with the same calm silence that had become my shield, answering only when necessary, reminding him with every pause that respect is not granted by proximity but by action. He tried to reclaim his footing at another gathering, boasting once again of his achievements. But when someone interjected to ask how much of his success had been funded by me, he stumbled, his face flushing, his voice cracking, and the laughter that followed was not with him but at him, and in that moment I saw the final crack split across the tower of his arrogance. He grew bitter then, lashing out in smaller circles, accusing others of betrayal, accusing me of undermining him. Yet no one believed him, for the truth was already written in their memories, and no amount of denial could erase the governor's words or the silence that had exposed his lies. His arrogance, once his armor, had become his prison, isolating him from the very admiration he craved. And though I felt the sting of sorrow as a father, I also felt the steadiness of justice, For I had endured his mockery long enough to know that this fall was not mine to prevent, it was his to endure. I watched him shrink in rooms where he once dominated, his voice softer, his gestures uncertain, and though some pitied him, most simply turned away, for nothing is more distasteful to the world than arrogance laid bare. I did not gloat, I did not celebrate, but I stood taller in those days, my back straight despite its aches, my eyes steady despite their years, and in my silence I found strength. For I knew that his fall was not my victory, but his lesson, a lesson carved in the stone of humiliation, teaching him that respect cannot be inherited, cannot be faked, cannot be seized, and once lost, it is harder to recover than gold scattered in the wind. The fall of his arrogance left him a shadow of the man he once pretended to be, and though he still resisted humility, I could see it pressing on him, chipping at the pride he clung to, forcing him to face the truth he had tried so long to deny. And in that truth, I found not vengeance, but vindication. For the son who once mocked me as old and tired now stood exposed as young and empty, and the world, at last, saw the difference. The father's triumph was not loud. It was not measured in shouts or banners, or even in the applause that had once filled the hall, but in the quiet strength that returned to me after years of being overlooked. For I had spent so long swallowing the sting of disrespect, convincing myself that silence was love and endurance was duty, yet in the end it was truth that triumphed, truth revealed in the governor's words, in the whispers of the crowd, and in the crumbling of my son's arrogance. And as I walked through the days that followed, I felt taller than I had in years, my steps steadier, my back straighter, not because my body had grown stronger, but because my spirit was no longer burdened by shame. The triumph was not over my son, though he had wounded me deeply, but over the years of invisibility I had endured, over the belief that my sacrifices had vanished into nothing, over the fear that my worth had been buried beneath age. For now I knew that everything I had done had not been forgotten. It had simply been waiting for its moment to surface, and when it did, it burned brighter than I ever imagined. I saw it in the eyes of neighbors who greeted me differently, not with pity but with respect, in the way men who had once walked past me stopped to shake my hand, in the way young people leaned in when I spoke, eager to hear the stories of work and endurance that had shaped my life, and in their attention I felt the kind of triumph that cannot be taken away, the triumph of knowing that dignity, once reclaimed, becomes unshakable. My son, who once mocked me as old and tired, now walked in the shadow of my recognition, and though he tried to hide his discomfort, the truth followed him everywhere, a truth he could not escape, and while it pained me to see him struggle, I also knew it was the only way he could learn that arrogance is always punished, while humility is always rewarded. My triumph was not vengeance, though some might see it that way. It was justice, the balancing of scales that had long been tilted against me, and I carried it not as a weapon but as a shield, protecting myself from ever again bowing to the cruelty of dismissal. I triumphed in silence, in restraint, in the choice not to rub salt into his wounds, for true victory does not require gloating, it requires standing firm in truth and allowing arrogance to destroy itself, and that is what I had done. I thought back to the sacrifices I had made, the nights I went hungry, the years I worked until my body ached, the dreams I set aside so that he could chase his, and I realized that those sacrifices were not wasted, even if they had not shaped him as I had hoped, because they had shaped me into a man who could endure, who could wait, who could withstand insult, until the day truth rose like the Sunday. My triumph was that I no longer carried the burden of silence, for the world now knew what I had done. And even if my son never thanked me, never acknowledged me, I had been seen, and that was enough. I walked with peace, my heart lighter, and though I still loved my son, though I still wished he would learn the lesson before pride destroyed him completely, I no longer feared his words, for they had lost their power over me. The Father's triumph was not in the fall of the Son, but in the rising of the Father, in the reclamation of dignity, in the restoration of respect. And as I stood in the twilight of my years, I knew that my story would not end as the tale of a man dismissed as old and tired, but as the story of a man who endured, who gave, who sacrificed, and who, in the end, was recognized not for wealth or power, but for honor. And that, more than anything, was the triumph I carried with me. The final word I leave behind is not one of bitterness, but of truth. For I have lived long enough to see that respect is not a gift that can be demanded, not a title that can be purchased, not an inheritance that can be passed from father to son, but a treasure earned slowly, built brick by brick through sacrifice, patience, and integrity. And though my own son once mocked me as old and tired, though he tried to cast me aside before others, fate chose to reveal the truth at the very moment he believed me defeated. And in that revelation I found not only vindication, but peace. I think often of that night in the hall, the chandeliers glittering above, the crowd holding its breath, the governor's hand reaching for mine, and I realize now that it was never about him alone, never about the applause or the whispers of admiration, but about the restoration of what arrogance had tried to steal, the dignity of a man who had given everything for others and asked for nothing in return. My son has learned his lesson the hardest way, for the memory of his insult will always linger in the minds of those who heard it, contrasted forever with the respect that followed. And though he may one day find humility and rebuild himself, he will carry that scar as a reminder that pride unchecked always leads to ruin. I do not rejoice in his fall, for no father truly rejoices in the suffering of his child. But I do stand firm in the justice of it, for he needed to learn what I could not teach him with gentle words, that arrogance isolates, that cruelty exposes itself, and that the world honors not the loudest voice, but the strongest character. My final word is to him, and to any who would listen. Do not dismiss the old. Do not mistake silence for weakness. Do not confuse humility with irrelevance, for age carries with it a history of sacrifices unseen, and the hands that tremble now may be the same hands that once carried you through storms you never knew existed. I stand today with peace in my heart, not because my son was humbled, but because I was restored, because my sacrifices were not buried in the dust of time, because the truth rose when it was meant to rise, and because respect found its way back to me when I had nearly given up on it. I think of all the nights I spent working, the mornings I rose before the sun, the meals I skipped, the comforts I abandoned, and I know now that none of it was wasted, for even if my son could not see it, others did, and even if he never thanks me, the world has already spoken on my behalf. The final word is not revenge, for revenge fades, not victory, for victory can be fleeting, but legacy, for legacy endures. And mine is not in wealth or power, but in the lives I touched, the communities I helped, the sacrifices I made, and the dignity I reclaimed. Let my son remember that night. Every time he seeks to boast, let him hear the applause that was not for him but for the father he dismissed. Let him carry that lesson until humility softens his heart, and if it does, then perhaps he will one day stand not in my shadow, but in his own light, forged by truth rather than arrogance. Until then, I walk forward with steady steps, my head high, my spirit unbroken, and my heart at peace, for the final word has already been written in the eyes of those who now look upon me with respect, and no insult, no arrogance, no dismissal can ever take that away again. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.